For a long time, Jaguar harboured the ambition to take on the likes of the BMW 5 Series, Audi A6 and Mercedes E-Class. And it took them until 1999 to do just that with this, the S-Type, introduced at the Birmingham International Motor Show in 1998, featuring these distinctive retro curves. But there are many people that think that the S-Type did miss the mark. So we thought we'd take a drive in an early example like this to see if they're right. So for much of the 70s and the 80s and even the first part of the 90s, Jaguar had made do with just a two model lineup. The XJ and XJS were all that the company had to offer. There was often talk of bringing in a car to slot in below the XJ, but frankly it took some $4 and some serious investment in their Castle Bromwich factory to see the S-Type come to reality. The basis for the S-Type, of course, was a rear drive platform that Ford had developed that would also formulate the Lincoln LS and Ford Thunderbird. But that's not a bad underpinning to have, and because Ford could lean on its engineering expertise and Jaguar were then plugged into those teams in Dearborn and Whitley, it meant that they could have an input into what that platform and what that chassis would look like to ensure that although it's got its Ford origins, it would drive and ride and handle exactly like a Jaguar should. The car was introduced with a 3-litre V6 and 4-litre V8 petrol engines. And they're good engines, 248 brake horsepower for the 3-litre V6 and about 280 horsepower for the 4-litre. But there was no 4-cylinder petrol or diesel engines, there was no diesel engine at all in fact from launch, and only the one body style, just the 4-door saloon, whereas its competitors were offering all of those engine choices, often a coupe in the case of the Mercedes or an estate in the case of BMW. So it had lost its competitive edge pretty much from the start. The retro styling is an interesting thing because it can be quite divisive. There are many people that love those retro curves. They're obviously harking back to the Mark II, and yet it's called an S-Type, so the nomenclature is a bit confusing in that regard. The problem with the retro styling fundamentally is that they were trying to reach out to a new generation of Jaguar buyer, and those sort of graceful curves that are reminiscent of a 1950s car, it was very anti-trend. If you look at the clean-cut lines of an Audi A6 or an E39 5 Series, the S-Type's a country mile away from that. But the interior is also where I think the car lets itself down. Frankly, it's just not very special. There is some wood and there's some leather, but the seats don't look very inviting. The gauges in front of me look very cheap. This sort of oval centre console just is very plasticky. Cheap grab handles, this flimsy ashtray lid, plastic door handles here. So overall it just doesn't feel very sumptuous or very luxurious. It doesn't live up to the Jaguar name. Jaguar obviously realised that they'd missed the mark in terms of attracting younger buyers, because in December 2000 they introduced the Sport model. It came with a de-chromed look and some rather snazzy 18-inch BBS alloys. But that still wasn't really enough. And come 2002, a facelift was looming. A more distinctive grille on with the badge incorporated at the top. There was a much nicer interior, much better quality fixtures and fittings. The 2.5 V6 was introduced, so that provided a new entry level. And crucially, a new halo car was introduced. The 4-litre V8 was jettisoned for the 4.2 V8, and then there was the 4.2 supercharged V8, the S-Type R, with 400 horsepower and 0 to 60 in just over 5 seconds. It was a proper BMW M5 chasing machine. So they were definitely getting somewhere. It was a much more improved car by then. And crucially, for the European market at least, the 2004 car finally offered you a diesel model, the 2.7 V6 turbo diesel that had been co-developed with Peugeot Citroën. It was a pretty good engine, but again, its rivals were offering 4-cylinder diesels which were arguably more economical and certainly better for the fleet market. But the other challenge it had, it was also competing with itself. If you wanted a more traditional Jaguar, you could still step up to the XJ. And actually the X-Type was its biggest thorn in its side. That had been introduced in 2001, so just a couple of years after the S-Type. The saloon X-Type had a bigger boot than the S-Type. It did offer a 4-cylinder diesel engine by 2003, 4-wheel drive, saloon and estate models, and of course it was at a cheaper entry price. So the X-Type was probably nicking conquest sales from the S-Type by that stage as well. The real pity of all of this, of course, though, is that the S-Type fundamentally was a good car, and it was fundamentally a good car from the outset. And I don't even blame Jaguar for the retro styling, because actually Jaguar weren't the only manufacturer playing the retro game at that stage. Remember, Volkswagen relaunched the Beetle. BMW were bringing out a new kind of modern retro Mini. There was the Chrysler PT Cruiser. I could go on. There were loads and loads of designs that were trying to sort of ape back to a golden age, but yet for some reason it didn't land with its intended audience. But you know, the ride, the suspension is good, it's refined, it's comfortable. The performance from the 3 litre or 4 litre V8 engines is actually really good. You shouldn't underestimate the S-Type. It was a competent car, slightly misthought through. And of course, like a lot of Jaguar stories, they did try and salvage it. And one can't argue with the numbers. Almost 300,000 S-Types found homes. And if you really want further vindication of how good the S-Type was, it's worth noting that the XF that replaced it in 2008 is fundamentally an S-Type underneath, with a much more contemporary body style. And the XF's been a phenomenal success for Jaguar. If you can make peace with that styling, the Jaguar S-Type is a modern classic, well worth considering.